A list of sensitive themes and topics covered in this episode can be found in the episode description. Welcome to This Guy Sucked, the show where we prove that it's never too late to have haters and you can't libel the dead. I'm your host, Dr. Claire Aubin, and I'm a historian, writer, and most importantly, as you all know, certified hater. On this show, we talk about people from throughout history with legacies that need a little updating. Whether it's because of their politics, their behavior, or their impact on society and culture, these guys actually kind of sucked. And we bring in a new scholar every week to tell us why. With me today is Dr. Imani Mosley, who is an assistant professor at the University of Florida School of Music. She is a musicologist and cultural historian, specializing in 20th century British and American composing/composers, which is why she's here today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Because I feel like this is a question people will ask/probably ask you all the time, so I'm sorry if you're tired of answering it. For the audience, what is a musicologist and what does that have to do with history?
Great question. We don't even know the answer, which is why I love whenever anyone asks us that question. So the really simple definition of what a musicologist is someone who talks about the history of music, the study of music, and I mean that in the kind of widest, broadest possible sense. I like to tell people that some musicologists are historians. Not all musicologists are historians. They don't all self-style in that way. You can be a musicologist and not be a historian, even though we all have some degree of historical training. I consider myself a historian, as well as the just kind of dyed-in-the-wool musicology label. And so what it has to do with history is that we talk about historical musicologists, which is usually the term that people like to use, is we talk about music throughout time and how music is related to people, events, culture, philosophy, all the ways in which music has come up within the world. And so we have to do history in a very similar way that regular historians do. We just have this one little added piece, which is this musical byproduct. We're very similar to art historians in that way, but with extra neuroses, I think.
Maybe different neuroses.
Yeah, maybe different. I mean, I think I would say different and extra, but yeah.
Bonus neuroses.
Yes.
Okay, so I think that actually provides us with a good segue into who and why we are talking about the person that we are talking about today. But who is it to begin with?
So we're talking about Percy Grainger, who is a early 20th century British-Australian composer, rather Australian-British composer, born in Australia and made his name in England.
What is he famous for? Like, what is his, if someone had encountered him or if they hadn't encountered him and they're just now hearing of him, what would they how would they know him? What are the things he's famous for?
Sure. So anyone who's encountered him most likely did it when they were 15 in band. So Grainger is like, if you played in your high school band, you know who Percy Grainger is. He's probably most well known as this kind of quintessential wind ensemble, wind band composer. And so I like to think about people in high school having these very kind of traumatic experiences playing Grainger's music, which I'll explain in a bit. But that's probably the thing that he's most well known for. He also was an early ethnographer, so he collected a lot of folk music and folk songs at the beginning of the 20th century when that started to be a thing that was possible via recording technology. So the minute we have these kind of like mobile phonographs, he goes out into the world and collects folk songs. So he's also well known for that. and he's a linguist and philologist, though that does not come up quite as much for people who are not sort of in the world of Grainger, but that's a huge part of his legacy. So yeah, mostly writing wind band music, music that military bands play. Also, that's his big claim to fame.
He's also really into sort of the revival and the collection of British folk music, right? So that is the other thing that the other way that I had come across him. I was a middle school band person.
Sure.
Every episode I have to drop some lore. But yeah, I was in some bands as a youth. And I also encountered him in some of the like compositions and arrangements/rearrangements he did of folk music are in particular.
Yes.
So probably a lot of people will have heard his music in the background of films and things like that.
Absolutely.
Because it is used to sort of signify like quaint Britishness, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've ever heard a very kind of lush arrangement of the folk tune that we call Danny Boy, it's very likely that it's probably Grainger's arrangement that's known as Irish Tune from County Derry. So yeah, those folk song arrangements that he did for vocalists, for choirs, and for bands pops up kind of everywhere. Also for piano, he himself was an acclaimed concert pianist. So a lot of his arrangements also exist for piano or for four-hand piano, two pianists. So very much background music as someone's riding on a train throughout Lincolnshire or somewhere like that. You'd probably hear his arrangement.
100%. There are some other sort of like interesting things about his life. Again, this is pre the what's wrong with him, but that I think contribute to why it's important to sort of talk about him in this nuanced, critical way. So he moves to the US in 1914 at age 32, but before that, he's very prolific and very talented as a child. He attends the Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt at around age 12 or 13. His father is this architect in Australia. His mother is a hotel heiress. His mother is also, this is not why he sucks, but contributes to it. He has a very strange relationship with his mother, who is which I think is putting it lightly. But she's sort of this, what we describe as sort of autodidact. Like she teaches herself all these things and becomes obsessed with teaching him a lot of things.
Yeah.
She's very interested in his development as an artist, very invested in his future as an artist. And so she's taking him around Europe and introducing him to all of these sort of important European artists and composers too. Because he's living in Europe and he's around this sort of musical milieu, he starts to meet really important European composers like Frederick Delius. I'm sorry, I don't know my composer.
That's okay.
And Norwegian romantic composer Edvard Grieg, which is very, very important to him. And that is someone that people will almost certainly have come across. You will have heard at some point in your life, whether you realize it or not. So he has these really strong relationships with these European composers who he sees as being really like the height of composing. And if people already can't tell with where this is going, I will be shocked. He's also, as a youth, very obsessed with Nordic culture. This is a big part of him and his contributions to the world, right?
Yes. So, his biographers and many people who've written about him have said many times about how the fact that when he was young, about 10 or so, he used to lie awake at night, stressed over the fact that the English language had been corrupted, basically, and that he wanted to sort of right the wrongs of modern English. So he had a real problem with the Norman conquest, basically England was great until 1066. And then it's just a kind of like sharp downhill from there, because the minute that we have the Norman conquest, we have the introduction of French into the English-speaking language, and it disseminates and gets weird as the years go on to create the English that we now know and love and hate. And he sees that particular moment as this huge point of divergence where everything kind of goes wrong. So this is sort of the beginning of this infatuation with all things Nordic. And he uses Nordic as a weird kind of stand-in for a whole host of things. So it does mean sort of Scandinavian countries, but some other things as well. It's very like, Kalmar Union, Rise Up, North Sea League. So he learns, he's a polyglot. He learns Dutch and Danish and bits of Norwegian and Swedish, Icelandic, Faroese. This becomes a big part of his own sort of language making and thinking about things. But this is how he starts to create this sort of racial hierarchy for himself, at which the Nordic race, which is the terminology that he uses, becomes his primary focus. And it really undergirds everything that he does, says, composes, moves through the world. It's at the heart of it. I mean, at one point he says, the only things that I kind of preoccupy myself with are sex, race, art, and sport. And he was not kidding. Like, those are his main concerns. And I would say that race and sex are kind of like duking it out for which one is going to be the top one. But I would say, for our purposes, it's probably race.
And what's so funny is we haven't even fully gotten to what's wrong with him yet. This is just like things that you need to know to understand him. Yes. Like this is a foreshadowing of what the problems are going to be.
Oh, yes.
I mean, who among us from age 10 has, from age 10 has not been obsessed with racial and linguistic purity? I just think it's so wild that so many of these things that he ends up being real preoccupations for the rest of his life, and which are the real point of this show, are things that he gets interested in literally as a child, and maintains as being sort of central to his worldview from then on out. And I think this also fits with the understanding of his mother as being this like intense, almost like emotionally incestuous character in his life. He has all these really strange relationships with his parents. I mean, his dad dies, but with his mother. And so there's like his whole thing. I will say this, now we're however many episodes into the show. By the time this comes out, I'll have recorded quite a few of them. But I will say, this is one of the weirdest guys that I have encountered thus far for the show.
Oh, I'm so glad I could be the one to do that. He's very strange.
He's very strange. Everyone else, not everyone, but a lot of the other people I've read are like, okay, well, they're kind of illogical, or they're a little bit, they're violent, they're whatever. With him, yes, he is those things. And also, everything you read about him, everything written by him, etc., is this like wild, bizarre, fantastical ride is the only way I can describe it. And so I did not know who he was going into this episode. When you told me that this is who you wanted to talk about, I thought, okay, sure, I'm open to whoever. That sounds great. I looked him up and was like, oh my God, who is this guy? It's crazy. Some of these are so wild.
He's deeply strange. And, I think one of the reasons why he becomes so attractive to us as musicians and as musicologists is that when we're introduced to him at that sort of middle school, high school age, we don't get any of the reasons or even the sort of scope of his strangeness, but there are things that peek through. And then it starts to make sense the the more you learn about him. So, anyone who's played his music will understand this. In the actual sort of sheet music, we'll get all of these tempo markings and direction markings. So basically instructions on how to play the thing that he's asking you to play on the page. Very typically, regardless of what kind of art music you're playing, those instructions will be usually in Italian. They may be in French, they may be in German, depending on the composer. But even composers who are French or German will often use Italian markings, but not Grainger. There's not Italian word to be seen. And so you're a 15-year-old who's playing his music for the first time, and you get a direction that says like stumpy or loud in lots or haltingly. And you're like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know. Like, I learned like crescendo. Right? I don't know what
you're learning
andante.
Means. You're learning fortissimo. You are not
right. Yeah, you're
stumpy.
Not learning stumpy or any of these things. And you're watching your director try to explain what those things are to you. And you're like, whispering to the person sitting next to you, why doesn't he just say crescendo? Right? Like, why doesn't he just use the words? But nobody explains it to you, right? Nobody tells you why his musical grammar is what it is, right? Or that he uses the time signatures. This is basically just what tells us what the meter is of the piece that we're playing, why he uses the weird time signatures that he uses, why he has this sort of predilection with arranging folk tunes, because in many of his pieces, he won't call himself a composer, he calls himself an arranger, right? Because they are songs that he has gone out into the world and recorded and then put into this format, whether it's for choir or for wind band. And again, you're like, okay, well, I kind of understand that, but I don't know why he styles himself this way. And nobody tells you, right? You're just like, okay, the music is weird and like the way it's written about is weird, but that's just who he is, right? And it's only later, if you have the opportunity to read more about Grainger. I mean, I came to this because I work on British music. And it's like, oh, that's why? Of course no one is going to tell you this at 15 years old, 16 years old, if the band directors even know themselves, right? This is not the thing to address to a room full of high schoolers, right? Or a room full of middle schoolers. But you do wonder because you're faced with stuff you've never seen on the page before and you never see it anywhere else. Again, no other composer does this, uses those terms. So there's a thing that kind of, sticks up in your brain that goes, this guy's kind of weird. Well, I wonder what that's about.
Yeah.
And then you just don't know all of it till later.
Yeah. And to get to the reasons why he sucks, because I think we're almost there. The sort of like spoiler alert to the reason why he's doing the writing his own music notations in this like sort of funky J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis-esque thing is because he's trying to purify even the language that he's using when he's writing. So he's trying to, for example, this Norman conquest thing that you brought up, he's trying to get rid of words that have Greek and Latin roots, which is one of the more, many things are wild about this guy, but reading his writing where he tries to do that in his writing, which I'll read a passage later in the episode, but is so wild. And so what he was trying to do, even with things like music notation that you're coming across as a 13, 14, 14-year-old clarinet player is,
right?
is you're discovering that he's saying, I don't want people to even use Italian words with my music because I want my music to even be linguistically pure. And, no surprise to anyone, that purity plays out in lots of other ways in his imagination. So let's get to why you think he sucks. Hi there, it's Claire. The episode you're currently listening to is free for everybody, but the next one won't be. Because we're trying to make this show independently and sustainably, we switch off between free weeks and Patreon weeks. So if you are a fan of good, accurate public history made by actual experts, consider supporting our Patreon. It's only one tier, which means that everyone who subscribes gets access to the same perks across the board. For the price of a pair of socks, you'll get access to a new episode every week instead of just the bi-weekly free ones, and they'll all be ad-free for you. You'll also get access to the full episode archive, bonus content, early access to merch, and lots of other fun Patreon exclusives to sweeten the deal. Just head over to patreon.com/thisguysucked or follow the link in the episode description to sign up.
Percy Grainger basically was a racist. And I will put an asterisk by that because there are a lot of people who, this requires some nuance, I think. We can't call him a racist in the way that we would use that terminology now, with the understanding that there is a sort of deep vitriol or hatred for people who are of other races. That was not really Grainger's concern, as far as we can tell from any of his own writings or the things that people have written about him. But he is deeply preoccupied with race in a way that permeates absolutely everything. So the way he writes about his own music, the way he writes his own music, what he chooses to set as sort of inspiration, how he talks about other music that's happening at this time, and then also like kind of deeply personal things, the people he's in personal relationships, the way he moves through the world, the way he sees the world, everything about how Grainger understands himself and the world is through this very specific understanding of race. And it's kind of not cool, but it's also very strange the way he employs it. You know, my friend calls him a creative racist.
Totally.
which I like quite a bit. And so having spent all of this time as a performer, before I got to this point where I knew all of these things about Grainger, not understanding that that was the thing that made the music go, and then learning about it felt like a kind of weird musical betrayal in a way. Like, why didn't anyone take the time to explain to me that this is why the music looks, sounds, feels, operates the way that it does. And I see that as a musicologist and as a performer as a huge problem. But also, we can't understand any of his music really if we don't talk about race, because he has even said that, like, this is the thing. It's the most important thing, and it is the only way to really understand what I'm trying to do. And that is paramount over pretty much anything else. So every relationship that he has with another composer, the way he writes about music that's happening at this time, music that's happened in the past, everything is through this very specific lens of race and racial hierarchy, which is very problematic.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of what I was coming across with him is not necessarily that he like hates other races, which I think is what makes it so difficult for people to understand him as this person who is very, very supremely dedicated to racial hierarchies and ethnic hierarchies. It's not so much that he hates other races so much as he very strongly prefers the race that he sees himself as being a part of. And he very strongly privileges that race in his understanding of music, in his understanding of history, in the kind of music that he makes, in even the arrangements he's working with, the way he privileges specific instruments and the associations he has with those instruments and instrumentation in general. Like, all of these are colored by his understanding of race, and it's very easy to if you don't think about it in those terms to miss that this is key to everything he's doing. And you're totally right. He says repeatedly that it is key to everything he's doing.
Yes.
And there's an attempt, I think, I came across this a lot in the research that I did for this episode. There's a real strong attempt to rehabilitate him outside of that, or to find some other explanation for these things that I don't think exists or even has to exist. It just makes people uncomfortable to think of him that way. And so because they're uncomfortable about it, they just try to logic their way out of it and do these gymnastics around it. And it doesn't work, because he is even saying these things out loud.
Yeah.
He's writing them down.
He's made it very clear, like, at every point in time throughout his life. This is not something that's like a predilection of youth. Like, it continues throughout his whole life. He says, no, please let me make this so very clear. Like, let me be so fucking for real. It is about this. Like, it is about this. Like, there's no two ways around it. And, I have also, seen so much attempts at rehabilitation and apologia, because also there's lots of discussion about Grainger being an anti-Semite. And the language around that is, well, he's not any more anti-Semitic than anyone else was at that time. But it's like, okay, possibly, but I feel like it necessitates just a little bit more discussion than that, don't you think?
Yeah. And this is a good prompt for a quote that got me really heated, actually, when I was reading this. And it's not a quote by Grainger, it's a quote about Grainger that really pissed me off. As it pissed me off in a historiographic sense, and as a historian, because this was being written by someone who I think kind of considers themselves a historian, but clearly does not have the methodological training to be able to say that, which is fine. It happens, but they're mischaracterizing history in the way that they talk about Grainger. So in this article, the author writes, is it any comfort that Grainger's racism was hardly unusual in his day? Does that make it simply disappointing rather than deplorable? And perhaps people who are listening at home will grow tired of me saying this, but hardly unusual for who? Too often, when we think of historical figures with complex legacies like Grainger, we defend them by offering a justification that suggests that their beliefs or their behavior were acceptable. But this is a retroactive assessment that we're applying to them. We think that these things are or were. Sorry, I'm on a rant. I'm on a roll. We think that these things were / are historically acceptable because we've learned about them as a normative part of life because the people enacting them, people who are sympathetic to Grainger, for example, have had an enormous amount of power over what we consider to be history and historical norms. This is another example, if the guy saying certain races shouldn't be allowed to read and write in the way that like enslavers were, if the person saying those races shouldn't be allowed to read or write is part of the group who are allowed to read and write, who do you think is initially writing the history of the relationship between these two groups of people? Like, it's not written by the victors, it's written by whoever has access to power. And it's bullshit to look at people like Grainger and say, well, he's a man of his time and everyone was thinking that. Again, the other people who he was thinking that about were not thinking that.
We're not thinking that. We're not thinking that. And we're at a moment in time when for people who are thinking about music, this is a huge issue because we're entering the beginning of the 20th century. There's this feeling like we are careening towards the thing that will be World War I. And, Europe is still reeling from this very chaotic nation forming period. And so there's a lot of discussion in music about musical superiority being akin to some kind of racial or ethnic superiority. And like these conversations are happening and not everyone is in agreement. So the idea that Grainger's own thoughts about race is somehow appropriate for the time, like, we know that that's not true, even musicologically. Like, that is absolutely not the language that's happening in this moment. And so there's a movie that was made about Grainger's life in 1998 called Passion. And I only watched it recently when I knew I was going to do this because I've been trying to find this movie. As you can imagine, it's an Australian movie, and so in 1999, a kid in North Carolina is not going to be able to get access to this Australian art movie about Percy Grainger, even though I wanted it really badly. And so when I knew I was going to do this, I said, "Oh yes, now it's finally time for me to get my hands on it." And thankfully, some wonderful soul uploaded the whole thing to YouTube. So shout out to you, whoever
Incredible.
you are.
That is public history in action.
Right, we live for it. And at the beginning of the movie, we're about 8 minutes in, and Grainger and his mother are in the UK, and he's performing a big public concert, and the Queen is there. I remember this is 1901, and he meets her after the performance and starts talking to her in Danish. which is fine for who we're talking about, Queen Alexandra. And so she's like, okay, I guess we'll do that. And so they're having a conversation in Danish with each other where everyone else is kind of like, what are these two people talking about? And it starts off fairly normally. And then he says something to the effect of, it's so great to see the reunification of the English and Danish empires. And she's like, huh? What are you talking about? And she's like, oh, it's only been like 800 years. And she's like, oh, okay. And he goes on this whole screed about like how much better England was, again, before the Norman conquest. And she's just like, what the fuck is this guy saying? So even though this is obviously a fictionalized representation of a meeting that maybe didn't even happen, but even then, they're like, he is saying these things to people, and people are like, nah, dude, absolutely not. You sound like an insane person, and who is talking about race in this way? So, like, I really, really have to push back on a lot of the ways that some writers about Grainger have really tried to rehabilitate him in this language about race, as if he is talking in a way that everybody is talking, and therefore that makes it fine, because he isn't talking in a way that everyone is talking. And again, to your point, like, fine for whom? Like, in relationship to whom, right? So I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
I mean, even being like, well, everyone is anti-Semitic at this time. Okay, you know who probably didn't appreciate that? The Jews that they're talking about. Like,
yeah,
it's a really baffling, not even baffling once you understand historical methodologies and how history is written and by whom, and for what purposes. It's not that baffling when you think about it in that way. But if you just look at how frequently this argument appears, and how publicly accepted that argument is, it's a deeply frustrating thing as someone, who spends all your time thinking about this. There are a few other things that came up when people were talking about Grainger, and we can actually / should get to some literal things that Grainger said and wrote, because sometimes people are like, we want more facts. But there's another article I read written in, we have them. Imani sent me the most insane thing for there's an interesting article called The Paradox That Was Percy Grainger that came out in 2014 in the London magazine that itself also starts from some very strange assumptions, chiefly that artists are popularly imagined to be immune to or above social / political / cultural issues, which is obviously just blatantly untrue. And is probably just what the author of the article imagines. But then they have to spend the whole time being like, but Percy Grainger was a little bit different. He was different then, too. Yeah. All of these things. He was weird at the time that he was writing and living and existing. Like, he was already weird then. Which is just, the whole thing is funny. There's, I'm going to give you an example.
Yes.
To give you an example of some shit that he said / wrote, because I need people to get this sort of how race is so fundamental to everything he's saying. In 1939, he wrote a letter to his friend, composer Roger Quilter. So this is in a conversation with another musician and composer. Quilter had expressed his distress at the suffering faced by Jews during the Reich. After talking about the Jews, the individual Jews that he personally admires or treats well, which includes his secretary or his former secretary, Grainger writes, "My own horror arises out of a wish to see nature realize her dreams. Horror at needless destruction of nature's dreams," whatever the fuck that means. "I do not pretend to understand nature or even to sympathize with her aims. I do not know why nature should give birth to dreams like peace, kindliness, impersonality. I will not say that I am sure I really share these dreams myself. We're getting to the weird part. I think I would always prefer to see some cruelty practiced, provided it had a sexual color. For instance, to see a child or a woman whipped or otherwise ill-treated, than any kindness I can imagine. But I am passive in the hands of nature. I bow to her aims and dreams as far as I understand them, and I can see that nature has given birth to peace, kindliness, impersonality, tenderness, wistfulness in one race, the Nordic."
The Nordic.
What?
Oh, man. Yeah, so there's a lot there.
He was like, I'm going to write this in a letter to my friend. Wild.
Oh, yeah.
He's opining on the nature of nature. He's opining on sexuality and nature. He's also opining on how, once again, let's bring it back to what really matters, the Nordic race.
The Nordic race. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that all of that is Grainger in a nutshell. I apologize for the pun, because he did write a piece called "In a Nutshell," and I didn't mean to do that. But you wouldn't have known if I hadn't said anything. So there we go. But yeah, that is the distillation of Percy Grainger. All of those things. He talks about nature a lot. He anthropomorphizes nature in a very weird way when he talks about what it is that makes Nordic music, quote unquote, Nordic music, more interesting, do music better than other types of music. He talks about virgin nature. Nordic music's ability to convey nature in the natural and sort of its purest, realist form. That's one of the reasons why he is so fascinated with folk music and folk song and those kind of portrayals of nature. He sees the people who make folk songs in certain places as these sort of agents of nature, right? So he has a whole sort of feeling about the performance of music, this idea of the composer and then the musical object. He doesn't really like performers. He thinks performers actually get in the way of conveying that naturalness that comes like directly from nature to the composer out into the musical object, which is why he's so fascinated with machines. He loves pianolas and piano rolls because they are not human interpretants. But he sees folk singers as this kind of composer-like thing that is a part of nature. So they are not performers in the way that musicians in a wind band or a choir are performers, because they are this thing that is uniquely tied to the landscape, to nature and how it works. And this is not a particularly individual view. We see this in other people in the past. Charles Burney, when he goes and surveys other people within the sort of wider British Empire in the 18th century, he has a whole feeling about primitive races being more musical. Because they are closer to the sort of start of it, not what we would say is evolution. Obviously, we're not quite there yet using that kind of language, but that's what he's thinking. And so, like, the use of complex rhythms and meter is more natural, and those things become simplified and rarefied as we get to the European race. Grainger is kind of saying something similar without the sort of aspect of primitivism. So because he sees those people as part of nature and part of the landscape, that they are going to be sort of more inherently musical and perform music in sort of more complex ways, which is why when he goes around to different places recording things on phonographs, and then he arranges those things, instead of being like a Hungarian composer Bela Bartok, who also is going all over Hungary and recording folk music in a similar sort of way, instead of how Bartok notates those things, which is very traditional Western art music notation, Grainger's like, it has to be exactly the way the singer sang it or whatever. And so the time signatures are weird, the meters are weird, the phrasing is weird, because he doesn't want to get in the way of the natural. But that can only exist for the people that he deems to be that, which is anyone who belongs to the sort of Nordic race, which again is still slightly unsure and kind of nebulous. So all of that is connected in this very weird way, and also his feelings about sex and sexuality. He calls himself a sadist. That the only way that he understands sex and sexual relations is through cruelty. So he is very much a big fan of a sort of warlike spirit. So like when World War I happens, he's kind of excited about it. He doesn't relate to, again, like you said in that quote, these ideas of sort of peace and kindness and winsomeness, even if he believes that it kind of comes from nature. Him personally, his own personal identity, like, can't jive with that. So he's like, well, if it does happen, it happens in the Nordic race. And so for that, it has virtue. And I want to talk about it in this way through these people and through this music. I personally can't access it because I'm a sadist and I personally think people should be whipped. So it's a lot.
Hi, everybody. It's Claire again with my usual quick shout out to tell you about other Multitude shows I think you might be interested in. Today, I want to talk about the show that got me hooked on Multitude's whole catalog, which is Join the Party. If your nerdiness is not restricted to history and extends to things like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, this is the show for you. Join the Party is an actual play podcast with tangible, engaging worlds, genre-pushing storytelling and sound design, and collaborators who make each other laugh every week, as well as me as the audience member. Join GM Eric and players Amanda, Brandon, and Julia as they welcome everyone to the table, from longtime TTRPG players to folks who've never touched or listened to a role-playing game before. You can start by hopping into their current campaign, the drama and excitement of a superhero high school told using the game Masks, or you can marathon one of their previous completed stories, which include Plant and Bug Pirates, Monster of the Week at a Summer Camp, and High Fantasy Worlds. What are you waiting for? Pull up a seat and join the party. Available on your local podcast app. Yeah, and I mean, I wrote down violent alternative sexual proclivities, and I'm not going to yuck anybody's yum as long as everyone involved is a consenting adult, do your thing. But actually what I think is interesting about this, that he's into that stuff is not why he sucked, obviously. Right. I don't give a shit. But the way that he's writing and thinking about these things does suggest a sort of rich, inner, imaginative fantasy life, a fantastical tendency, or even an inability or like a desire not to separate inner fantasy from material reality. He's not able to have fantasies about the world, about himself, about sex, about race, about his relationships with his mother, with his wife. He's not able to separate those from what he believes are material realities in the world, like where things come from, what the historical reality of something is, why things are the way that they are. He can't separate the way that he's thinking in his mind about them from what is actually happening. And I think Sex is a good example of that, where he regularly talks about how he's not able to separate his fantasy life from things he feels he must enact, things he has to do, things that must be done to him as well. And so the whole thing is like this, the sex thing is not what's wrong with him. It's the way that he thinks and talks about it reflects the way that he thinks and talks about other parts of his life and the world. But he is also really fucking obsessed with sex.
Oh, deeply obsessed with sex.
Really obsessed with it.
Like, the man was, big old freak 7 days a week. And again, that is not why he sucked, but it reveals so much about how Grainger moves through the world, the way he projects himself sexually, both while he was alive and posthumously, is really deeply fascinating. The fact that, here I was, like, college age Imani, doing some research, and coming across this book about Grainger and stumbling to, the middle of the book where all the pictures tend to be, in books like that, and seeing these pictures of Grainger naked, self-styled photographs that he had taken of himself and of his wife after they had engaged in flagellation and self-flagellation, and being like, oh, I don't know why I'm seeing this. And then learning that he actively said, please have these things available after I have died, right? And so he is curating these aspects of his life for future onlookers, and he makes the active choice for that to be a part of that curation, which, I think most people maybe wouldn't, or at least maybe not to that extent. Like the fact that we're seeing all of these photographs that he's taken of himself. There's a letter that he wrote that shows up in a sort of posthumous edition of his letters. That's basically like, it's titled something to the extent of what to do if Percy Grainger or Ella Grainger, this is Percy's wife, are found dead, right? And the letter basically says, if you find one or either of us dead in a way that doesn't seem like, it's not old age or something like that, and you find either of our bodies and our bodies look like they have been, some severe violence has been enacted upon them, please know that we did that to each other. And we also recognize that engaging in these kinds of sexual acts could, for someone who is young and otherwise in shape, bring about something like cardiac arrest, something that would cause you to just die. And so please do not investigate it as a murder. We were not murdered. And that's the whole letter.
I can't even like process the idea of being like, sorry to my parents who will probably listen to this, but I can't imagine being like, if I show up dead, if my wife or I show up dead early, it's because we is a crazy, crazy thing to have written down. I can't.
And that is
like, I'm sorry. That is wild. And again, that's not the problem.
That's not the problem.
Even when he's writing about these things and he's doing the curation that you're talking about, that also indicates this inability to separate fantasy from material reality, where he's being like, okay, well, I'm also fantasizing about how people will imagine me after I die. And therefore I must ensure that that is how they imagine me after I die. Like he has fantasies and needs to make them real. And so, or he needs to find some justification for their reality. And it's just, I mean, yeah. And some of the things we've said where we're like, okay, he's really into the Nordic race. It's also worth mentioning that he does very specifically talk about how the Nordic race is better than other races. It's not just that he's only into the Nordic stuff. But I think this is also a good example of him fantasizing about this sort of mythical, what I wrote down, him being a Nordic freak guy without him, without just him doing sort of this mythical thing. He also, in order to do that, he has to come up with sort of realities that reflect that. So a quote I have from him is, "Must we Nordics?" So now he's because he feels he's assimilated into Nordic culture through his study of it. And because he's also blonde and blue-eyed, that's a big thing for him, is that he's tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. He says,
and not just blonde and blue-eyed, but like really blonde and really blue-eyed.
Yeah, and he's also he's one of these guys. No, please. He's also one of these guys that everyone like. I hate when they do this. We just did this in another episode, but where historians are like, he's so hot. He's a Byronic beauty. His aquiline blonde, his aquiline nose, his blonde hair. What a gorgeous man! And I'm like, oh God, okay, whatever. But that's so happening with this guy too.
Yes, I mean, I'm looking at my copy of the new Percy Grainger Companion that has this painting of him on it. That's very Twink-like. That he's just this like very, very like thin, tow-haired, sparkling blue. Like, no wonder all he thought about was sex. Like he's always been described
you were that hot.
Yeah, you would be doing the same thing. And it's like, well, all right, everybody cool it.
Chill.
Chill.
Would I think that if I also was doing sort of proto-Nazi shit? Probably not.
Right.
But, okay, so the quote I was going to say is, he writes this in the thing that you sent me. Must we Nordics go on forever shamming that we do not know that we are overmen in beauty, soul depth, spirit powers? Must we stand by silently forever while the lower races, parentheses, French, German, Jews, tell us they own powers and gifts that we know they don't? Not only does he see himself as Nordic, but he's also like magical and everyone else are liars.
Yes. That whole article is talking about, I mean, the whole article is absolutely nuts. I mean, everything that he writes is nuts to some degree, but this one especially, which is why I sent it to you, because this is where it's one of the clearest ways in which he talks not only about the superiority of the Nordic race, but how this directly comes in contact to the way people are thinking about music at this time, which is, you know, we are coming off of these centuries of kind of Austro-Germanic supremacy in Western classical music, and they are seen as the innovators, the creators, the kind of people who hold the keys to this like hegemonic way of doing music composition. And you know, this is post Wagner, right? Like Grainger is born in 1882, and so you know the beginning of his life is in this kind of post Wagnerian moment. And so there are all these feelings of people who are like, yeah, actually, maybe these composers maybe they are the ones who've got it all figured out, right? And he's like, no, absolutely not. Not only have we been lied to all of these years with all of these people telling us that the Germans are the ones who know about music or beauty or art or life, and that people saying that they know all of these things has actively put a sort of like, you know, boot on the neck of the Nordic race. And it's time now. We have the freedom to show the world that we, the Nordics, again, this man is from Australia. Like I cannot stress this enough. He is Australian. Not that you can't be Nordic and Australian, but he's not. So I just want to make that very clear.
He's not.
You know, but he's not. He isn't. But it's time that we rise up and we show everyone that, you know, we have always been the ones who have been the progenitors of beauty and art and actual real musical composition, and how dare anyone say otherwise. So this idea that he actually doesn't believe in a kind of like racial hierarchy and racial superiority is just, it's not true. Whether those feelings kind of lessen as he gets older or he talks about it less in that way, I think there is a little bit of that, but it's not like it never existed. It's not like he's never said, you know, that there is one race that's better than the others, and it's this one, the one I've been talking about since I was literally 10 years old. It's that one, the one that I say that I belong to.
And I think what's funny about that, or there are a lot of things that are funny about this, to be fair, but one of the things that's funny about this is I feel like he talks about Nordic people the way that like Lord of the Rings fans talk about elves, where he's like, yes, there's this special race that are more beautiful, they're more magical, yes, they're more musical, they get along with the natural world. And when you start seeing his thinking in that light, it's a little bit more, at least to me, comprehensible, where you're like, oh, he's just kind of crazy, but also he's crazy in a way, or he's strange and you know, existing outside of reality in a way that still coincides with serious social and cultural problems of the time that he's alive in. I will say though, I don't want to give Percy Grainger flowers because he's a terrible person, but it is very funny though, the way that he talks about French and Germans, which is not,
oh my gosh,
which does not fit with the way that the Germans see French and Germans later. Like because you know, it's also he's kind of doing this sort of proto-Nordic Aryanist thing.
Yeah,
but he is also saying things like, ugly swine such as the French and the Germans. I mean, in the main, I know that a German here and there has the gift of beauty. Should not be ashamed of themselves for their loathsome beautylessness. And then talks about the shapes of their skulls, their heavy bellies and legs. Heavy bellies, small legs. He doesn't like small legs.
Yeah.
He said thick thighs or nothing, baby. He taught, which, you know what? Go off.
Sure.
Cool. But whatever. He has like the things he says are also like they're what I would classify, and what we actually said before we recorded this episode. This sort of old school European style racism, like old timey. He hates the Jews, but he also hates the French and the Germans. Yes. Like it's not about skin color. It's about what he sees as inherent racial characteristics in the way that Europeans are thinking of race at this point in time, or actually
Yes.
at a much earlier point in time than this point in time.
Yeah.
He's bringing back this sort of like early racial ethnic animus that I think is if you don't understand it that way, it's hard to get what's wrong with him. But when you start to figure it out, you're like, oh, okay. Because his whole thing is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who, as a musicologist, I mean, anyone in musicology will tell you any time that anybody kind of like dunks on Germans is really humorous, just because it happens so rarely, and it's like, yeah, okay, go off, King. But he talks so interestingly about, like, he has to make these really important distinctions in order for this view to make sense. And he says that he thinks about race as a sort of lived experience, in the sense that it animates everything that everyone does. So, like, everything that you create is reflective of this racial identity, just regardless of whether you choose to do it intentionally, right? So because he sees Germans as being devoid of beauty, they therefore cannot make anything that has beauty in it. And the thing that I think is really interesting is that he makes a very specific distinction between the Nordic race and the Teutonic race, whereas somebody like Wagner would say, well, aren't they kind of related? And he's like, no, absolutely not. Those German Teutons over there with their weird stocky legs, they don't know anything about beauty. They're not like these tall, svelte, blonde-haired, demigods from Sweden. And like the fact that he has to make that very specific distinction at a time where it might have otherwise been collapsed for personal, professional, racist reasons, like really goes to, again, this idea of this kind of inner world that he is then making a kind of material reality, that he's got to say, oh no, actually, like, you need this very clear definition, because you might think when you hear Nordic, based on the way that other people have maybe used that term in the past, that includes this much sort of wider scope of people and place and ethnicity. And I'm actually saying, no, it doesn't. And here's why. And it kind of works in both directions, where this idea of, okay, there's been this long history of music composed by German composers, to which he says, no, I don't like it, and I don't think it's good. And every now and then, because Grainger's favorite composer was Bach, who was, last time I checked, very indisputably German. And he tries to find these ways to attribute the way that Bach does things well as sort of non-Teutonic. But he's thinking about all of these composers and compositional techniques that have existed for a really long time. And he says, no, it's not good. It's also not good because of the people who made it. Like, by proxy of them being who they are, it is also not good. And my music is in direct opposition to that. And it is in direct opposition to that, not necessarily because my music is good, but because it is the byproduct of my racial categorization. So it cannot be what all of this other music is, because that music is reflective, again, of this kind of racialized existence. And because my music is a representation of my racialized existence, it therefore is going to operate and live and be understood differently musically. So it's all kind of tangled up in each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And even when he talks about other musicians, so in that same letter, essay, screed thing that you sent me, he does talk about this just a little bit. He talks about Debussy. He says he calls him one of his life's art loves, and says, amongst other things, I introduced his music into 8 lands. But he says, he can see some bewitching beauty in Debussy, but he does not rise to the peaks of Nordic grandness, Nordic understanding of the all life, the Allfrith, whatever that means. He also then later talks about Bach, Wagner, and Brahms, and says he says that their nearly Nordic, if not quite Nordic, souls can at times rise to the full heights of pure Nordic beauty. But he's being very clear, saying they can do that sometimes, but no whole work of theirs is as lovely as it might have been had they been real Nordic people like me.
Right.
So he very clearly says this informs the kind of music that he writes and how he thinks about music. So to separate the two of them is simply not possible, because he is saying they're inseparable. Like he's saying, no, this is made up. The things I'm writing, the way I'm approaching music, the things I'm thinking are made up of this thing, are necessitate this other thinking that I'm doing. So he sucks.
He sucks.
He sucks. I mean, basically, he sucks. It's kind of the highlight here. I mean,
pretty much.
His whole thing is wild. And I really strongly suggest to anyone listening to this to go and look up some of the things that he says and writes, just so that you can understand the way he even writes and you can kind of hear what's going on in his head. But I mean, with even the writing, to sort of actually bring this back to some of the linguistic stuff that we started with, even within his writing, he acknowledges that he's trying to engage in linguistic purity, because he'll make up words like out-singled, which he'll make up a word and then he'll put the sort of commonly used word next to it. And the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to, reinstate the Saxon and Scandinavian roots into these words. And so he'll say out-singled means certain, or this one he says soul tilth means culture, mind tilth, education.
Mind tilth, yes.
Part against part metments, which mean, or part against part meetments, which means proportions.
Yes, part meetments. Yes. And it's like, what are you the lengths that he goes to kind of engage in this sort of linguistic purity, like the words that he comes up with, they're often these kind of weird word hyphenates. Sometimes the words like in like soul tilth, the other word will be not an English word, or very old English word, that he employs throughout all of his writing. It's so funny because in many of the edited volumes of his writings, there'll be like a translator's note, like an editor's note, like a glossary, like these are the things that he's actually trying to say. And so even within his own letters, like things that you'd think maybe he would sort of like relax, I guess. Like that is the place where you really see his commitment to these ideals, is because he is inserting this language everywhere. And so, the editors of his letters will be like, there is, in addition to these words that he's created, he'll write in English, he'll write in Dutch, he'll write in Danish, he'll write in German sometimes, and German kind of stands in here for this kind of like old European professional language. He also writes in Faroese, in Icelandic, in Maori, or what he calls Maori. After he goes to New Zealand, he becomes really fascinated with Maori language. But even more interestingly, I think, is the private, intimate language that he creates kind of from nothing, which is he creates this language that has, I believe it's Danish at its root, for parts of the body, and specifically genitalia,
classic.
And
of
classic.
Course.
and sex acts. So he, like, I'm pulling up my little list here now, of some of these words that I'm not going to be able to pronounce correctly, because I unfortunately don't speak any of the languages that he employs here. But
Listeners,
I will
get in the chat.
Yeah, please
all
help
of our
me out.
Scandinavian friends.
Yeah, Scandinavian Hive, please, this is your time. So he has a long-term girlfriend who is Danish, who I love that when writers talk about her, they're like, well, she has brown eyes, but he lets that go. Like, he doesn't even want to date like a woman who doesn't
what a
have
lucky
blue
girl.
eyes. Oh yeah, I mean, hey, they were a match apparently. But he writes this
Is
letter
this
to
the
her.
one who
Sets
becomes his wife? She's Swedish. His
No,
wife is a
she's
Swedish
Swedish.
lady.
Yes, yes. This girlfriend is also Swedish. This is before the
Gotcha.
woman
Okay.
who becomes his wife, Karen Holton.
Gotcha. Okay.
So he creates this language kind of with and for her. In the volume of essays and letters from which I sent you that Pure Nordic Beauty one, there's a whole section that's entitled like sex. And it's all of his writings about sex. And you see a lot of these words come up. And so it's stuff like, so he says to her, quote, "It seems to me we lack words for many parts of the body." And I'm like, I don't think that we do, but I mean, sure, go up. And he says, "I suggest the following." Again, I apologize in huge advance because I don't know how any of these are pronounced. Just gonna have to go with me here. Mavebrister, which literally means tummy breasts.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
What body part is...
It's the butt. Because
Shut up.
Yes. No, because because he gives explanations for all of these things. And he says, for what Herman calls, and again, it's another Danish word, possibly rove, ass, and which have got new importance since you now receive guests from the back.
God. The real freak hours all day, every day with this guy.
The red light was on all the time.
The thing is, right, like these are funny. Like, this is funny. And it is easy to be like, this guy is this funny, crazy person. But also, like, I think, and that's the difficulty with him. And that's why we're talking about him and why it's important to talk about him with someone who actually knows what they're talking about, right? Is because it's important to integrate these two things together in understanding him and being like, you can be an insane person who writes wild things. And also, we can be like, you're a straight up racist, and these things, they don't have to be, one doesn't have to determine the other, one doesn't have to preclude the other one from being true. It's okay to talk about both these things, because he also seems to be of sound mind while he's doing all of this.
Oh, yes. 100%.
So he just is, like, I think a lot of people have kind of portrayed him as this sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a very sort of, chaotic, artistic, creative, silly,
very quirky
guy.
Yes.
Yeah, he's just like a quirky old professor kind of guy. And it's like, I don't know about that. And again, I think to sort of wrap a lot of this up also is, again, he's very actively positioning the future that he wants, for himself, even after dying. He is saying, this is how I want to be remembered. So we are actually remembering him the way he wants to be remembered.
Oh, yes.
To be clear.
100%. It's important to note that, so there is a Grainger museum in Melbourne where he's from, and he started to create that museum while he was alive. So he was like, there's going to be a museum about me, you guys, and here's what I want to be in it, and this is how it's supposed to look. He sends these like paper mache, like full-size paper mache dolls of himself and his mother and his wife to be used as kind of like, sure, why not, right? You know, the things that you just have around the house, a lifelike paper mache version of yourself. He sends these to the museum to be like, this is how things are going to be modeled, because like he makes these things called toweling clothes. He made his own clothes. And like, so the clothes have to be put on the model of him. And again, to talk about like, this is how he's actively sort of curating himself. He says about his toweling clothes, and this is a thing that he writes and ends up in the museum. He says, and around 1910, after this is he and his mother, both had been fired by the beauty of Maori and South Sea Island clothes and fabrics seen in museums in New Zealand and Australia, my mother mooted the idea of clothes made of Turkish towels. Cool in the summer, warm in the winter, da-da-da-da. I leaped at the idea, seeing therein a chance to return to something comparable with the garish brilliance of the sky blue and scarlet garments of our Saxon and Scandinavian forefathers. I resented very much that the darkness and dullness of more southerly European fashions, parentheses, after the Norman conquest, close parentheses, had ousted the bright colorfulness natural to the north of Europe. So, like, even in this, like, again, there's this very easy way of us thinking about him as this kind of weird, kooky guy. Oh my God, he made clothes out of towels. Isn't that so bizarre? Even that is insight into how his idea of race fashions everything in his life, and that he is telling us in that moment that this is how we need to understand him. This is not something that people come up with. It's not musicologists or music theorists or historians now who are saying this is the way we need to think about Grainger. All of this stuff comes directly from him. He says, this is the way. If you want to know who I am, this is the way to do it. And yet we don't get it when we're encountering his music. I mean, again, I don't know that I necessarily should have heard a lot of this stuff when I was 14. I think it would have like rocked my little baby brain. But you know, I'm pretty sure that that's not the reason why I didn't hear it. And it does our sort of larger understanding of Grainger a huge, huge disservice.
Yeah, and I will also say, it's not like we're saying this because we have some kind of grudge too. It proves that it's not like, oh, there's some secret, agenda here where we're trying to make everyone sound like a racist. Actually, what we're doing is directly remembering him the way that he specifically is asking people to remember him. And the other people who are remembering him are the ones who are erasing the parts of his past that he was trying to make sure would be preserved. So, because I think we're out of time, I would like to formally say that we are remembering him the way he would want to be remembered, which is as a Nordic freak guy who definitely sucked.
Definitely sucked. And anyone who knows me knows that I love Grainger's music really deeply, and I have a deep personal relationship with it. And that has never gotten in the way of me saying that he is a weird little sex pervert racist who sucked.
Yeah. Little pervert racist guy. We have many. And I think he's also the second guy we've had on the show that if he were alive today would absolutely be on Reddit being the most annoying person you've ever encountered in your life. He's on the r/Norman conquest. Just never shutting up.
Lighten it up. Never shutting up. Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show. I didn't need to really be convinced as soon as I read like 2 sentences of his writing. Dr. Mosley can be found on Twitter at Imani Mosley, Blue Sky also Imani Mosley. Do you have anywhere else people can find you?
No, I'm all over the internet, very easily findable. My website is imanimosley.com. I'm the Imani Mosley on the internet.
The one. And to be we have the Imani Mosley on the show. All of these things will be linked in the episode description as always. And everyone go have a good day. And maybe if you listen to any Percy Grainger, do it with an asterisk in your head from now on out about what a real freak guy he was. Thanks for tuning into this episode of This Guy Sucked, a member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. This episode was hosted by me, Dr. Claire Aubin, featuring special guest Dr. Imani Mosley, and produced and edited by Tom Umani. All of our theme music was written and produced by concrete artist Marshall Dean Williams. If you'd like to support the show and get access to all episodes, including 2 extra episodes per month, and access to our full archive of episodes, you can subscribe at patreon.com/thisguysucked. See you next week.